January 17, 1940, Washington, D.C. The air inside the munitions building hung thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic tang of winter cold seeping through old walls. In a cramped office on the second floor, a room officially designated as the Army's Signal Intelligence Service, but known to its 8 occupants simply as the shop, a man named Frank Rowlett sat hunched over a desk cluttered with worksheets covered in 5-digit number groups. His eyes burned, his fingers were stained with graphite. Outside, the city moved through its routines. Clerks bundling against the wind, senators debating neutrality, citizens reading headlines about a war across 2 oceans that still seemed like someone else's problem. Inside this room, Rowlett was fighting a war that hadn't yet been declared against an enemy machine that didn't yet know it had one. The worksheet before him represented 18 months of failure. 18 months of intercepted Japanese diplomatic transmissions that arrived as incomprehensible static, strings of numbers that refused every mathematical approach, every frequency analysis, every pattern recognition technique that cryptanalysis had developed over centuries of code-breaking. The Japanese called their system Angoki Taipu B Kata Obun Inji, but American intelligence had given it a simpler name, Purple. And Purple was supposed to be unbreakable. The machine that generated it used telephone stepping switches, a technology so novel, so mechanically complex, that replicating it without ever seeing the original seemed less like cryptanalysis and more like archaeology conducted backward, reconstructing a dinosaur from its shadow. Rowlett's colleagues in British intelligence at Bletchley Park were focused on German Enigma. A worthy opponent, certainly, but one whose rotors followed logical, predictable paths. Purple was different. Purple was madness crystallized into electric current. And on this January morning, with dawn still 2 hours away, Rowlett noticed something in the pattern of vowel substitutions that made his exhausted mind suddenly, violently awake. It wasn't a breakthrough. Not yet. It was the faint outline of a door where before there had been only wall. He would later tell his wife that the moment felt less like discovery and more like recognition, the way you might glimpse a familiar face in a crowd of strangers and realize, with a jolt, that you've been searching for this person without knowing their name. The recognition was this. Purple's designers had made it fiendishly complex in its execution, but had preserved a fatal simplicity in its structure. They had separated vowels from consonants, processing them through different pathways. And in that separation, in that single architectural decision made by engineers in Tokyo who believed their creation was perfect, lay the hairline fracture through which an entire empire's secrets would eventually pour. But in January 1940, that fracture was still invisible to everyone but Rowlett, and even he couldn't yet articulate what his intuition was screaming. All he had was a feeling, and feelings didn't decrypt diplomatic cables. The world that morning was balanced on a knife's edge between history's chapters. In Europe, the phony war stretched across the winter. British and French armies dug into the Maginot Line, German forces poised behind the Siegfried Line, both sides waiting for a spring that would bring real violence. In Asia, Japan's war machine ground through its 3rd year of conquest in China, Nanking's atrocities already fading from international memory as the world's attention fragmented across too many crises. And in America, the political establishment clung to neutrality with the desperation of men who had seen one world war and would do anything to avoid another. But neutrality is not the same as ignorance, and ignorance was a luxury the United States could no longer afford. Throughout the 1930s, as Japanese militarism metastasized from political faction into national ideology, American intelligence had watched with growing alarm. The Washington Naval Treaty's restrictions had been discarded. The invasion of Manchuria had revealed Japan's willingness to defy international consensus. The Marco Polo Bridge incident had ignited full-scale war with China. And beneath the visible march of armies lay something more dangerous. A diplomatic apparatus that spoke the language of peace while preparing for a conflict that would reshape the Pacific. Reading Japan's diplomatic intentions wasn't merely advantageous, it was existential. The Japanese Foreign Ministry's communications carried the empire's true strategic calculus. Which resources were critical, which territories were next, which American actions might trigger escalation, and most importantly, whether Tokyo's diplomats were genuinely negotiating or simply buying time for the military to position its pieces. Throughout the late 1930s, American codebreakers had successfully penetrated multiple Japanese systems. The consular code, the naval attaché code, various commercial ciphers. Each breakthrough had provided fragments of insight, enough to track the empire's ambitions without fully illuminating its soul. Then, in 1939, everything went dark. The Japanese Foreign Ministry introduced Purple, and overnight, the most critical intelligence pipeline into Tokyo's strategic thinking simply ceased. Intercept stations scattered across the Pacific and along the American coasts continued capturing transmissions. The signals were there, crackling through the ionosphere, bouncing off atmospheric layers, arriving at receiving antennas as reliably as sunrise. But arriving and understanding were oceans apart. The messages might as well have been written in an alien language, or more accurately, encrypted by an alien machine whose internal logic obeyed no human pattern. The urgency wasn't theoretical. Europe's war might still be across the Atlantic, but Japan's ambitions circled the Pacific like a tightening noose. American territories dotted that ocean: Hawaii, Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, each one a strategic asset and a potential hostage. The U.S. Pacific Fleet represented America's primary deterrent, and that fleet was vulnerable in ways that admirals understood but couldn't quantify. How vulnerable depended entirely on what Japan was planning, and what Japan was planning was now hidden behind Purple's impenetrable curtain. So in that cold Washington office, Frank Rowlett and his skeleton crew of mathematicians and linguists weren't just solving an intellectual puzzle. They were racing against a clock whose alarm they couldn't hear, but whose expiration might come as bombs falling on American ships, American territories, American lives. They were trying to read tomorrow's obituaries while the ink was still wet on today's newspapers. Frank Rowlett had not expected to become a spy. Born in rural Virginia in 1908, raised in a world of tobacco farms and small-town certainties, he'd shown an aptitude for mathematics that earned him a scholarship to Virginia Polytechnic Institute. He'd imagined becoming a teacher, maybe a professor, living out his days in the comfortable obscurity of academia. Instead, in 1930, a classified ad seeking junior cryptanalysts had caught his attention. Not because he knew what cryptanalysis was, but because the salary was $70 a month and the Depression was making alternative employment scarce. He arrived in Washington expecting a temporary posting, a few years of civil service before real life began. Instead, he found William Friedman, a legendary figure in American intelligence despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that almost no one outside a classified circle knew his name. Friedman had cut his teeth on World War I's cryptographic battles, had systematized code-breaking into something approaching science, and now ran the Army's tiny signals intelligence operation with a missionary's zeal and a mathematician's precision. Under Friedman's tutelage, Rowlett discovered that code-breaking wasn't just mathematics. It was psychology, intuition, pattern recognition, and an almost mystical ability to think like the enemy cryptographer you'd never meet. By 1939, Rowlett had been part of multiple successful operations against Japanese codes. He understood the language's peculiarities, the way diplomatic Japanese structured its messages, the common phrases and formulas that provided cribs, known plaintext that could be matched against encrypted messages to derive keys. He knew the Japanese diplomatic mind, its formality, its indirection, its careful parsing of obligations and implications. This knowledge made Purple's resistance all the more maddening. He could feel the language beneath the encryption, like recognizing a friend's silhouette through frosted glass, but he couldn't reach through to touch it. What Rowlett and his colleagues knew about Purple was fragmentary and inferential. They knew the Japanese had replaced their previous machine cipher in February 1939. They knew Purple used telephone stepping switches. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese Foreign Ministry procurement orders for the devices, a clue that seemed absurd until you understood that the Japanese believed American signals intelligence was too primitive to matter. They knew the basic structure. Each character in the original message triggered a series of electrical steps through the switches, generating an output character according to an algorithm that changed with every new message key. And they knew that replicating this process without possessing an actual Purple machine, without even seeing diagrams or specifications, would require not just breaking the cipher, but essentially reverse engineering an invisible mechanism from its effects. It was like trying to reconstruct a piano by listening to music played in another room, then building an instrument that would produce identical sounds using only tools and materials you'd never seen the original manufacturer use. Except the piano was electromechanical, its internal state changed with every note, and you had to get every single component exactly right, or the entire effort produced only garbage. Through 1939, the team made no meaningful progress. They collected intercepts, they built frequency tables, they tested hypotheses about switch patterns, about rotor behaviors, about the relationship between plaintext positions and ciphertext outputs. Every hypothesis failed. Months became seasons, became a year of accumulated failure. The British, working on Enigma, had captured actual machines from U-boats and border conflicts, giving them tangible hardware to study. The Americans had nothing but electromagnetic ghosts and increasingly urgent warnings from Pacific Fleet commanders that Japanese naval movements suggested something large was coming. Then came January 1940 and Rowlett's recognition. The vowel-consonant split wasn't just an architectural choice, it was a vulnerability. If vowels and consonants were processed separately, then the switching patterns for each could be analyzed independently. The problem's complexity hadn't changed, but its scope had suddenly halved. It was still impossibly difficult, but impossible and merely improbable are separated by a gap just wide enough for obsession to slip through. What Rowlett couldn't know in that January darkness was that his Japanese counterpart had made the same mistake countless cryptographers before him had made. He had confused complexity with security. The engineer who designed Purple, a man whose name remains disputed even in historical records, though evidence suggests it was a naval officer named Captain Kazuo Tanabe, had created a marvel of electromechanical ingenuity. The stepping switches, harvested from telephone exchanges and repurposed for encryption, created a system with billions of possible settings. The key space was astronomically large. By every theoretical measure, Purple should have been unbreakable. But Tanabe, like so many brilliant engineers, had optimized for the wrong problem. He had built a machine that was difficult to reverse engineer through mechanical inspection, assuming that was the primary threat. He had protected against an enemy who might capture a Purple device and take it apart. What he hadn't adequately protected against was an enemy who would never see the machine, but would study its output with the patience of monks illuminating manuscripts, who would collect thousands upon thousands of messages and search for the mathematical shadows that the device's complexity couldn't quite erase. The vowel-consonant split was elegant from an engineering perspective. It allowed different switching mechanisms to handle different character sets, probably simplifying the internal wiring. From a cryptographic perspective, it was catastrophic. It meant that patterns in vowel positions could be analyzed without the noise of consonant substitutions interfering, and vice versa. It meant the problem could be decomposed. And any problem that can be decomposed can eventually be solved. Through January and February, Rowlett worked 18-hour days. His team expanded slightly. Solomon Kolbach and Abraham Sinkoff joined the effort, bringing fresh mathematical perspectives. They built worksheets that tracked individual character positions across hundreds of messages. They looked for repetitions, for statistical anomalies, for any indication that certain input positions correlated with certain output patterns. The work was mind-numbing and exhilarating in equal measure. Hours of mechanical tabulation punctuated by moments of sudden insight that either opened new avenues or collapsed into dead ends. They were building a ghost machine, not the actual hardware, but a mathematical model that would replicate Purple's behavior. Every confirmed pattern added another component to this invisible construct. Every successful prediction validated another assumption. By March, they had mapped the vowel switching mechanism. By May, they had cracked the consonant patterns. And on September 20, 1940, a Friday afternoon when Washington's humidity hung like a wet blanket, the team successfully decrypted an entire purple message from start to finish using only their mathematical model, without ever having seen a purple machine. The message itself was mundane diplomatic traffic about trade negotiations, but its successful decryption meant that from that moment forward, every communication between Tokyo and its embassies abroad, every strategic instruction, every policy debate, every hint about Japan's true intentions would arrive on American desks almost as quickly as they arrived on Japanese ones. The United States, still officially neutral, still technically at peace, had acquired the ability to read its future enemy's mind. William Friedman, watching his team celebrate in the cramped office, allowed himself a rare smile. Then he collapsed. The mental strain of the 18-month effort had pushed him into nervous exhaustion so severe he would be hospitalized for months. But the machine, the ghost machine, the mathematical phantom they'd built from shadows and intuition, continued working. Within weeks, the Army's engineers had constructed physical replicas of purple based on Rowlett's mathematical model. The machines were distributed to key intelligence centers, and the flow of decrypted Japanese diplomatic traffic, codenamed Magic, began illuminating Tokyo's strategic thinking with a clarity that should have been impossible. What Frank Rowlett and his colleagues expected from their success was the satisfaction of a problem solved, a puzzle cracked, a contribution made to national security that would remain forever classified and unacknowledged. What they got instead was a front-row seat to catastrophe in slow motion. Through late 1940 and into 1941, Magic intercepts painted an increasingly alarming picture. Japanese diplomats in Washington continued talking peace, while Japanese military attachés reported troop concentrations, fuel stockpiling, and naval exercises that could only have one purpose. The tripartite pact with Germany and Italy turned Japan's ambitions into part of a global Axis strategy. Resource shipments from Southeast Asia became critical priorities as American and British sanctions tightened, and threading through it all was the growing conviction in Tokyo that war with the United States was not just possible but inevitable, that the only question was timing and whether that timing would favor Japan or allow America to rearm. The intelligence was detailed, specific, and terrifying. In one intercept from July 1941, Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka instructed Japan's ambassador to maintain negotiations in Washington as a diplomatic smokescreen while military preparations continued. Another message detailed the threshold of American actions, specifically oil embargoes, that would trigger immediate military response. A November intercept discussed the importance of achieving strategic surprise in any coming conflict. The messages stopped just short of stating explicit attack plans, but their implications were unmistakable. And American policymakers received this intelligence with a mixture of belief and paralysis. They believed the threat was real. They believed Japan was preparing for war. But believing and acting are separated by political will, strategic options, and the enormous inertia of a nation still desperately clinging to peace. The Pacific Fleet was moved from San Diego to Pearl Harbor as a deterrent, putting American naval power closer to Japanese ambitions, presumably making Tokyo think twice. The Philippines were reinforced. Diplomatic channels remained open, pursuing increasingly implausible compromises. And beneath it all, a secret few knew and fewer understood. American intelligence could read Japanese mail, which should have been an insurmountable advantage, but which, in the terrible arithmetic of coming war, proved insufficient. The convoys, 11 of them, sailing between late 1940 and November 1941, represented one of the few unambiguous victories that Magic provided. Japanese submarine deployments in the Pacific were coordinated through diplomatic cables that included position reports, target priorities, and operational timelines. With Purple broken, American intelligence could read these deployments before the submarines even left port. Convoy routes were adjusted, escort patterns modified. Ships that would have sailed into ambushes instead took wide detours through empty ocean. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies. Freighters hauling rubber from Singapore. Transport ships moving personnel and equipment between American Pacific possessions. Each convoy represented thousands of tons of strategic materials, thousands of lives, and operational flexibility that would prove critical once the shooting started. The 11 convoys weren't widely known even within military circles. Operational security meant that most convoy captains never knew why their routes suddenly changed, never knew they'd been saved by mathematics and intuition working in a cramped Washington office. But in the ledgers of the war that was coming, 11 convoys represented an advantage measured in fuel, ammunition, and men who would survive to fight rather than dying in submarine ambushes that never happened. Yet these tactical victories couldn't prevent the strategic catastrophe. On November 26, 1941, Secretary of State Cordell Hull delivered an ultimatum to Japan's negotiators: withdraw from China and Indochina, repudiate the Tripartite Pact, and fundamentally reverse the entire trajectory of Japanese foreign policy over the past decade. The ultimatum was principled, morally sound, and diplomatically fatal. Tokyo's response came not through diplomatic channels, but through carrier-based aircraft on the morning of December 7, 1941. Frank Rowlett was in his Arlington apartment that Sunday morning when the phone rang. The voice on the other end spoke 3 words. It started, Hawaii. He didn't need elaboration. For over a year, he'd been reading Japan's diplomatic mind, watching the empire's intentions crystallize from possibility into probability into certainty. And yet the certainty hadn't been specific enough. Magic had revealed that war was coming, but not when or where the first blow would land. The Japanese Navy had maintained radio silence during its carrier task force's approach to Hawaii. The diplomatic cables had spoken in generalities and deadlines. And the attack had achieved the strategic surprise that Tokyo's planners had identified as essential. Pearl Harbor's devastation was measured in battleships capsized, aircraft destroyed, and over 2,400 American dead. But the attack's strategic impact went deeper. It shattered any remaining political barriers to American entry into the war. It united a nation that had been fractured by isolationist and interventionist factions. And it validated, in the most terrible way, the warnings that magic intercepts had been providing for months. The intelligence community had seen the storm coming. They had simply been unable to predict the exact moment lightning would strike. In the war's aftermath, there would be investigations, recriminations, and decades of debate about what was known, when it was known, and whether Pearl Harbor represented an intelligence failure or a political failure, or simply the fog of a world descending into chaos. But for Rowlett and his colleagues, the answer was simpler and more painful. They had broken purple, had read Tokyo's secrets, and had still been unable to prevent the catastrophe. Their success had been real, but insufficient. The symbolic object that threaded through this story, the object that represented American industrial capacity and cryptographic ingenuity, was deceptively mundane: the punch card. IBM's tabulating machines, originally designed for census data and commercial accounting, became critical tools in the purple-breaking effort. Rowlett's team used punch cards to sort and correlate encrypted messages, to build frequency tables across thousands of intercepts, to test hypothetical switching patterns against actual outputs. The cards accumulated in boxes, each one a fragment of data that meant nothing by itself, but which, aggregated with thousands of others, revealed the mathematical shadows that purple couldn't hide. The punch cards represented something the Japanese cryptographers hadn't fully appreciated: America's capacity for industrial-scale information processing. Japan's purple machine was a marvel of miniaturization and complexity, designed by engineers who valued elegance and sophistication. America's code-breaking infrastructure was brute force made systematic. Rooms full of tabulating machines, clerks feeding cards through readers, mathematicians analyzing outputs with mechanical assistance. It wasn't elegant, it was overwhelming. And in the calculus of cryptographic warfare, overwhelming beats elegant when the stakes are civilizational. After Pearl Harbor, Purple continued yielding intelligence throughout the war. Diplomatic cables revealed German-Japanese coordination, detailed resource shortages in Japan's empire, tracked peace feelers and strategic debates. The intelligence informed Pacific Fleet operations, helped prioritize bombing targets, and eventually contributed to the diplomatic isolation that made Japan's surrender inevitable. But the machine's greatest value, paradoxically, came before the war, in those 11 convoys saved, in the strategic warnings provided, in the preparation time that Magic's insights allowed. Rowlett himself survived the war and continued working in signals intelligence for decades, eventually retiring as a senior NSA official. He received the National Security Medal in 1965, a ceremony so classified that his own family didn't learn the full story of his wartime contributions until years after his death in 1998. The purple machines he'd reverse-engineered without ever seeing were displayed in the NSA's museum, bronze plaques crediting the codebreakers who had achieved the impossible. But Rowlett, in his rare public comments, always deflected credit to the team, to Friedman's leadership, to the collective effort that turned impossibility into operational intelligence. The deeper truth that Purple's breaking revealed, the truth that extended beyond cryptography into philosophy, was about the nature of secrecy and complexity in an interconnected world. Japan's cryptographers had built their machine assuming that security came from complexity, that making something difficult enough to reverse engineer would make it safe. They had underestimated two things. First, the enemy's capacity for systematic persistence, and second, the fact that complexity itself creates patterns that simpler systems avoid. Purple's weakness wasn't that it was poorly designed. On the contrary, it was brilliantly designed for the wrong threat model. It was built to resist physical capture and mechanical analysis. But signals intelligence in the 20th century wasn't about capturing machines. It was about capturing transmissions, accumulating data, and applying mathematical scrutiny at scales that exceeded any individual cryptographer's capacity. The telephone stepping switches that made Purple so mechanically sophisticated also made its behavior statistically analyzable. The vowel-consonant split that simplified engineering complicated cryptographic security. Every optimization toward mechanical complexity created mathematical signatures that, given enough intercepts and enough analytical resources, could be detected and exploited. The Americans who broke Purple weren't smarter than the Japanese who built it. They were differently equipped. They had IBM tabulators. They had a mathematical tradition that treated code breaking as applied statistics. They had William Friedman's systematic methodology that turned intuition into replicable process. And they had the time and resources to throw thousands of person-hours at a problem that seemed unsolvable until suddenly it wasn't. This asymmetry between complexity and persistence, between engineering elegance and analytical brute force, would define cryptographic warfare throughout the 20th century and beyond. The lesson of Purple wasn't that complex encryption was worthless. It was that complexity alone, without cryptographic soundness, created only the illusion of security. And in warfare, illusions kill. In the decades after the war, as documents were declassified and histories written, a question lingered. If magic was so valuable, if American intelligence could read Japan's diplomatic secrets from September 1940 onward, why hadn't Pearl Harbor been prevented? The answer was both simple and infinitely complicated. Intelligence is not omniscience. Knowing that an enemy intends war doesn't reveal when or where they'll strike. Diplomatic cables don't carry operational orders to naval task forces. And even perfect intelligence must navigate the turbulent gap between knowing and acting, a gap filled with political constraints, bureaucratic friction, and the terrible human tendency to mistake warning for alarm, to discount the unthinkable until it becomes undeniable. The 11 convoys saved represented intelligence working as it should, specific tactical information enabling concrete operational responses. Pearl Harbor represented intelligence's limitations, strategic warning without tactical specificity, arriving into a system not yet prepared to act on worst-case scenarios. Both outcomes emerged from the same source, Purple's broken security, but produced vastly different results because intelligence is never consumed in a vacuum. It enters human systems of decision-making, competing with other priorities, filtered through institutional biases, and ultimately translating into action or inaction based on factors that have nothing to do with the intelligence itself. Frank Rowlett understood this. In his private notes, declassified decades after his death, he wrote about the strange burden of foreknowledge. His team had read Tokyo's escalating frustration with Washington's sanctions, had seen the deadlines approaching, had understood that war was coming with the certainty of mathematics. And yet that certainty had been imprecise in the ways that mattered most: when and where and how. The knowledge had been enough to save 11 convoys, but not enough to prevent a surprise attack. It had been enough to inform strategy, but not enough to avert catastrophe. This burden, knowing without knowing enough, would characterize intelligence work throughout the modern era. Analysts would read intercepts about terrorist plots and face the challenge of distinguishing signal from noise, of prioritizing among infinite threats. Cryptographers would build increasingly sophisticated systems, knowing that sophistication itself could become vulnerability. And policymakers would receive warnings about futures that seemed unthinkable until they suddenly weren't, facing the impossible task of acting on intelligence that pointed to catastrophe, without providing a roadmap for prevention. The final image from this story isn't heroic or triumphant. It's mundane and somehow more powerful for its ordinariness. Frank Rowlett, years after the war, eating lunch in the NSA cafeteria, surrounded by younger analysts who didn't know his name or his contributions. The classified nature of his work meant that fame was impossible, recognition limited to an inner circle, legacy preserved in documents that would remain sealed for generations. He was a man who had changed history from a cramped office, who had saved thousands of lives and would never receive public credit, who had helped win a war by doing something most people couldn't understand even if it were explained. He would return to that same cafeteria day after day, eating sandwiches and reading newspapers that never mentioned purple or magic or the convoys that never met Japanese submarines. And perhaps there was a certain freedom in that anonymity. The freedom to know that the work itself had been sufficient, that impact didn't require acknowledgement, that some victories are won in shadows and recorded only in the subtle alteration of history's trajectory. The punch cards that had helped break purple eventually became obsolete, replaced by computers that could process in seconds what had once required months. The purple machines themselves were decommissioned, then preserved in museums where security-cleared visitors could marvel at the telephone switches and reflect on how much had hung on electrical circuits and mathematical intuition. The stories of the 11 convoys faded into classified records, known to historians but absent from popular memory. But the deeper legacy persisted. The understanding that warfare in the modern age would be fought as much with information as with steel, that knowing the enemy's intentions could be as decisive as superior firepower, and that sometimes the most critical battles are won not on beaches or in skies, but in offices where patient analysts transform incomprehensible static into strategic advantage. Purple's breaking didn't prevent World War II. It didn't save every life or win every battle. But it revealed a truth that would define the electoral future. Coming century. That secrets are never truly safe. That complexity creates patterns. And that persistence, armed with mathematics, can illuminate even the darkest cipher. Frank Rowlett's useless code, the mathematical framework that seemed like theoretical abstraction until it suddenly became operational intelligence, had saved 11 convoys before Pearl Harbor. More importantly, it had proven that the impossible was merely improbable, that dedication could substitute for inspiration, and that sometimes changing history requires nothing more dramatic than an exhausted mathematician noticing a pattern in the darkness and refusing to look away. The war came anyway, as wars do. But it came to an America that had already achieved one victory the enemy never knew about. The victory of reading tomorrow's secrets today. of turning the Empire's own words into weapons, of breaking the unbreakable because the alternative was accepting a future written by others. In the arithmetic of global conflict, those victories are measured not in territory or casualties, but in the futures that never happen, the ambushes that never spring, the ships that sail safe through oceans that should have been their graves. And in a cramped Washington office, long after the war's end, a set of worksheets covered in 5-digit number groups remained filed in a safe, evidence of the January morning when Frank Rowlett had seen the door in the wall and decided to walk through it, knowing only that on the other side lay something worth finding, even if the cost was 18 months of failure, even if the reward was a secret that history would barely remember. The cipher had been broken, the convoys had been saved, and the man who did it went back to work on Monday, because there were always more codes, more enemies, more futures that needed reading before they arrived with the morning's terrible news.